Great. Welcome everyone to a special presentation of story trading. First, a disclaimer: story trading is not an investment advisor, and investing in securities involves significant risk of loss. This presentation is being recorded. It will be made available to our VIP members first, who can attend live, and subsequent to that, it may be posted on YouTube after a short delay. Tonight, the topic is VTSI, but first, what's in a story trade? Story trading is understanding market pricing, also known as the story behind the trade, through the lens of the four pillars: fundamentals, catalyst, sentiment, and technicals. We have an app coming up, which will be the place to discover, collaborate, and validate market moving information through crowdsourced research and social collaboration. If you haven't done so, get first in line, go to StoryTrading.com, put your email address in. So when the private beta gets released, you'll be first to be able to test it out. VTSI is a VIP pick. It was actually never presented as a VIP pick. It first came to the attention of our community as a trade of the week. Subsequently, it just became a very popular stock in our community, and we officially started tracking it and calling it a VIP pick when CEO Bob Ferris spoke to us. So if you go to StoryTrading.com and click on VIP picks, you can see all of our VIP picks and the performance to date on them. So tonight we have Virta, VTSI. Actually, I don't know if the last trader is actually 726. I'm sorry, that was created in the middle of the day, had a strong close, roughly a 75 million market cap. Virta is in the business of virtual reality police training, and not all virtual, but basically police training. It's a riot play, which is what I like to call. It's been on my watch list as a riot play for, gosh, about 5 years. In May 2020, it became a trade of the week idea because of some riots that were happening at that time. And then again, we made it a VIP pick on January 24th when CEO Bob Ferris presented to us. Since his presentation, the stock is up 75%. And today we're going to have Kevin Crawford. We'll get more into Kevin's involvement in just a second. And he's going to be here after my few slides to give us some additional new information. So we're going to start with trying to understand the story behind the trade. Here's a long-term 5-year chart. And you can see here it was doing much of nothing for many years. And then there seemed to be some sort of inflection here, right there in May, roughly, of 2020. So what happened here? So let's dig down into the chart from that point so we can see exactly what's been happening since then. So as I said, it was introduced in the very last week of May as a trade of the week pick because of some riots. It took a couple days, but it had a strong week. It took off. And then it held its gains. Right. I don't have a comparison of the other riot stocks. I probably would be surprised if they held their gains. This is a very strong fundamental company. So the sharp gains it had over here were held over a multi-month period of time, I think because of strong fundamentals discovered by Wall Street. I don't want to just say our community, but there's sellers and buyers out there. And when they come and started looking at this stock at $4, they discovered, wow, this is a pretty cheap company. So it was able to hold its gains. And then what happened? Right here is when CEO Bob Ferris spoke to us. I was actually live in Miami Beach with Mark Gomes at the time. Bob Ferris came on the line. That was a fun event on Zoom. And coincidence or not, I don't know, you decide for yourself. But a few days later, that marked the bottom. And what happened next? Wow. So it went up for a while, and then we had blowout earnings, incredible historical volume. The stock was up 100% overnight, and it didn't hold its gains. The next day, actually that night at around midnight, they did an $18 million offering at $6, 3 million shares, no warrants. Surprisingly, it didn't hold $6. It went down below $6, went down even below $5. We invited the CEO back for another event. Both of these events are on our YouTube channel. And that, again, seemed to have marked the bottom, perhaps, when he came back and spoke to our community. All right, what happened next? Next thing is this little spike over here. There was some stuff, I believe it was actually first on Twitter or social media. I could be wrong. It may have been in our community. where there was some sort of screenshot being shared about VTSI bidding on a 24.5 million Department of Defense contract. Okay. I don't know the validity of that or anything. I'm just reporting what I saw here that caused these price movements. Shortly thereafter, in early June, VTSI presented at LD Micro, which again looks like it probably marked the bottom of the stock. But a couple days later, this is when Kevin Crawford stepped in. And he's been doing, prior to that, he was doing extensive, great research and due diligence on VTSI. He came to StoryTrading, and we had a dedicated event where he was going through his very deep due diligence, very popular video. It's on our YouTube. So I don't know, Kevin, you'll talk about this later, but was that your presentation in regard to that 24.5 million? Continued momentum there? I don't know. We'll find out. And since then, basically, stock has kind of held its gains. It's a consolidated a little bit. And, the next thing is earnings coming up. So let's move on to sentiment. It is a riot stock. It's a trend trade. The trend traders get into. It's a hot theme. For example, January 6th, the riot at the Capitol, the stock was up 26% at the high of the day on high volume. Police shootings in the news, things like that are very strong catalysts for this stock, sentiment-wise. Recently, there's been fewer, I feel, high-profile events in terms of police shootings. So that may be what, negative sentiment. Add it all up, you can decide for yourself where the sentiment is for this stock. All right, technicals. I work with Rexman, popular Rexman, to get a chart. Here's his lines over here on VTSI and some commentary. He says, needs to hold the upper fives, low sixes. If it does, this can hit the upper resistance at the red dots. That looks pretty high. He didn't give me oh no, there are numbers. In the 12s to 14s next. If it breaks past that, this can go for 20s and more. Okay. Also reversing off long-term shoulder supports at the 1s, 2s, so uptrend still intact. There's a shooting star this month though, so possible dips to low sixes in early August. All right, thank you, Rexman, for that evaluation there of the chart. All right, moving to the fourth pillar, catalysts. We went through the chart, so those past catalysts explains the price action on the chart. What are some next catalysts coming up? We have earnings on August 12th, which is pretty soon. Also, are we going to get a big military win? Kevin Crawford is going to talk more about that. Actually, that's our third pillar. I move around the order of the pillars based on the evening and kind of what we want to discuss. So the last pillar tonight, although it's probably the strongest pillar, is fundamentals. That's probably why I made it last, so we have a nice lead into what Kevin wants to talk about. But I took a couple data points from Y charts here. Revenue, you can see annually, it's been consistently going up. And then this is an interesting one, the shares outstanding, because actually one of the reasons I was very interested in this stock back in May 2020 as a riot play was because it had a low flow and they didn't really dilute. There was no history of dilution here. So I felt that this was a great trading stock that you can get into, again, with a low flow, with low risk of an offering, right? So many years there was no offering, and then boom, lo and behold, you get an $18 million offering after great results, but it was at a great price. It was at $6, which is way above where it was trading at like a couple of days earlier. So, but that explains what's happening with the shares outstanding. All right, another look at fundamentals. This print here, I believe, was the one that caused that 100% move on high volume. I think the headline was somewhere around a 20-cent EPS, which was a blowout, at least the headline number. There may have been, artificial accounting reasons for that. I don't know, but the trend kind of looks good, like a staircase pattern. And the quarter after that, not as good on the headline number, but a lot of good business momentum, and a lot of the other metrics are still good, causing the stock to maintain most of its gains. So with that, Kevin, I'm going to pass it on to you for an updated deep dive on fundamentals and catalysts. I'm going to stop my screen share over here. If you want to do a screen share, up to you. Take it away, Kevin.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. Just for clarity, the $24.5 million order was, or IDIQ was, from the Customs and Border Protection, which is one of Virta's larger clients. And IDIQ doesn't necessarily represent $24.5 million in sales that already happened. It's basically just a contract that says we may spend up to this amount over the next 5 years.
Got it.
So just for clarity there.
Sounds good. Thanks.
And then for catalysts, I actually think there's two of them. There's the immediate one on earnings, and then there's one after, and we'll start there. But before I start, I just want to like set the tone. If anyone has any questions or wants to interrupt me, please do so. I think I've done a lot of research myself, but it's kind of been in isolation, and I'm always open to hear dissenting opinions or if anyone wants clarification, I'm happy to do so, and hopefully that reinforces it for myself and anyone on the call as well, and anyone who listens. So raise your hand, or and I don't know how Zoom works, but if you want to moderate,
I'll handle that. Yep.
Cool. So I'll start with the later catalyst, and I think that's federal funding and mandated training for police. There was an appropriations bill that came through the House of Representatives, or that came to the House of Representatives like the 25th or 28th of July. And what it was calling for was mandatory police training for federal officers. And through funding, through grants, they were hoping to kind of get states to comply with that similar mandate for required training. Meaning if a local law enforcement office wanted to apply for grants, they had to have these mandatory training in place. So that's kind of the federal government's way of making the states comply, is giving them monetary kind of backing for complying. And I think from a valuation perspective, the Burn JAG grant program is, they have a call out for something like $40 million in grants to send to local police departments, specifically for de-escalation training, implicit bias training, mental health training, all these kinds of things that Virta is uniquely positioned for. I guess not uniquely, but they are positioned for in this market. There's other people in this space, but that 40 million, there's also another 30 million or something like that for similar programs. And essentially what it boils down to is there's going to be somewhere between 50 and 100 million in federal grants given out or available next year to be given out to police departments who want to do this training. And my hunch is that Virta, as the industry leader, is going to be in a position to receive some amount of that. I don't have any inclination if it's going to be 50%, 70%, or 10%, but they definitely will receive some. And I think that's just kind of a tailwind for Virta over the next 12 months. It's fiscal year 2022 for the federal government, so that would run through September 2022 as when funding should be provided. And I don't know when exactly they have to spend it, but I think that gives a good floor, or maybe not a floor, but at least a good boost to the stock or to the company should anything military wise not either work out or be as large as expected. But if everything goes to plan and they win a military contract, they have this police funding, there's essentially two different catalysts that are coming in the near future. I'll pause there. Does anyone have thoughts, comments, questions?
That's good. I want to get into, I'm curious, let me just throw the chart up there one more time, is that, it probably a lot of this move from the high fives, basically when that 24.5 million DoD contract was out there, like we're talking about 550, it went all the way up to 850, and now we're consolidated in the sevens and low sevens. I'm guessing a lot of this valuation is based on anticipation and speculation of possibly getting some this military business. So to me, that's a big question: is how impactful, if basically what are the chances that this would come? Question number one. And then the second thing is, if it comes, how impactful will that be to the earnings? So that if and when it does come, are we looking at a sell then use event because it's baked in, or are we looking at a total re-rating of the company to a much higher place? So that's what I'm interested in finding out.
Yeah, okay, we can go that way. And if there's time at the end, we can come back. But I think I laid out a pretty clear catalyst there as like a fallback, a second catalyst, I should say. But for that run up, I think obviously I don't know why it traded that way, but the catalyst for the military contract is essentially that Virta will be supplying their patented recoil kits to, it's my speculation that it's the Army for their IVAS program, which is set to launch in sometime September or early Q4. So in the event that they do win that, IVAS is, or Microsoft, for background, won a $22 billion 10-year contract to supply these headsets, these IVAS headsets, to the Army. So this is a long-term investment for the Army, and if Virta is a part of it, it's not necessarily a one-time windfall of here's a handful of orders in 2021 and that's all. It's a big opportunity for pretty much anyone involved, and this program specifically, more so than any in the past, are relying on small businesses and industry in general to kind of present their best technology, and Microsoft is partnering with the Army to try to find these best technologies and integrate them into this IVAS program.
So Kevin, you brought something up that I think deserves a little more in depth to go into. I think most people, when they go to Virta, they look at the website, they don't really know about those recoil kits. That's not the first thing. And, you know, it's not police. People don't think of that as police training or thinking software, right? So you mentioned that you think this opportunity is with recoil kits. So if you can just kind of educate our audience a little bit on what kind, you know, how big of a business that is for Virta, and if you've come across any clues or information that might suggest they're ramping up their recoil kit business, and maybe what the margins are on that business, just a little more depth into that, because it's kind of hidden. You know, when you get on a website, it's not obvious that they sell these recoil kits.
You've done your homework, Ben. So Virta's main source of revenue is simulators. So recoil kits are essentially a weapon insert that turn a real firearm into a simulator ready weapon by adding a laser, and they're called recoil kits because they add CO2 powered recoil. So it feels like a real weapon, it reacts like a real weapon, but it shoots a laser instead of a bullet. And that laser is how the simulator responds or interacts with the weapon. So while the simulators are the main driver of revenue currently or historically, the recoil kits are specifically the niche that I think Virta is, I think, and the CEO has clearly stated many times that he thinks this is a good fit for the military. So it makes sense that this is what they're going for. And I've done some market research on different recoil kits in the market. Virta has patents on their, in 2019, Virta bought patents to go along with one of theirs for simulating running out of ammo and the weapon jamming. They are the only ones with those patents, and it's one of the reasons why we think Virta is most best suited to win this work. There's only a couple different, there's only a couple different competitors in this space. In various training solutions, formerly known as Megit Training Solutions, has their own recoil kits, but it doesn't have this jamming and running out of ammo mechanically. I think they have a patent, or they have some, I can't remember if they have a patent or not, it's been a bit, but they have the ability to run out of ammo, but I think it's all done electronically. Virta has the ability to do it both electronically and mechanically. I haven't been able to nail down exactly why mechanical is so important, but Bob claims it's important. I think some of the military documentations call for the ability to do this both mechanically and electronically, these jamming and running out of ammo. So what they have kind of aligns exactly with what the Army is looking for.
Kevin,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you have any data points or clues that indicate they're maybe doing a production ramp on recoil kits?
Yep. So over, I think starting in late 2019, maybe, they started implementing an ERP system. Bob called out for inventory management and other things like that. They ended up implementing that on the Q1 call. They said they finished implementing that. They've done some hiring for second shift, meaning in their production facilities, which are specifically for hardware, which is threat fire devices and recoil kits. So we know they're ramping up, or they were ramping up production in the beginning of or early Q1 of 2021. And they've also hired, they've had at least a few open positions, like 3 or 4 or 5. And I think there's only 100 people at the company, or there were at the beginning of the year. Like 3 or 4 or 5 employees specifically for manufacturing. So they're growing their manufacturing team. We know they are targeting an opportunity for recoil kits. They have a bigger team. They have this ERP system, and they've raised money specifically that Bob's called out to increase production capacity. So I think stars are kind of aligning in my mind.
Okay, and margins of recoil kits versus the software, any idea?
Yeah, so just a little background. Bob has stated on a call with investors, myself included, that they've done about 8,000 recoil kits. They've sold about 8,000 recoil kits historically. He hasn't really guided too much on specific margins on specific products, but we know they've guided towards 60% gross margin being a good target for the company, for investors to kind of use. He did drop a hint in, I think, the Q4 conference call that if a large military, or if a large contract possibly comes through, there's a possibility that they take a hit on margins, have lower margins. I think he said it's in one of the conference calls if someone wants to look it up after the fact. I think it was Q3 or Q4 of 2020. So I just speculating here. It's going to be less than 60, we think. Whether that's 50 or 40 or 30, I don't know. But based on my research, I think a recoil kit typically sells for somewhere between $3,000 to $12,000 each, depending on the weapon. And there are some accessories with each recoil kit, like magazines or air compressors or something like that, and magazines that allow for jamming and ammo reloads. I'm trying to pull it up. I think cost $2,000 a piece. IVIS program specifically for the M4 weapon, I think wanted, for a single M4 weapon, they wanted 7 additional magazines for each weapon, for each M4. So that would be roughly $3,000 for the recoil kit and $14,000 in magazines per M4. So there's quite a bit of volume to go along with whatever margins come along. That's good.
That's good research. So let's get into the guts of it. Let's get into the fun part, right? You wanted to get this presentation in before the earnings. I think you maybe put some puzzle pieces together that you think this earnings will have some really good news in it. So can you tell us why you think that, what the percent chances in your mind are that they're going to get this military deal? And then what impact do you think that'll have for the fundamentals of the company in terms of us being able to calculate fair value after this happens?
Yeah, so I'll share my screen in a minute, but I want to start with a little bit of background. There's a few ways to think of metrics around sales. There's the actual sales happening in a given quarter. Someone orders, let's say 1,000 recoil, or like 10 recoil kits. That's, let's say, $1,000. In the future, whenever they deliver it, they recognize that as revenue. And if they don't deliver it, that's backlog. So I think that's clear enough.
Okay.
But why bring it up? And I guess additionally, there's government bookings, which are orders that the Virta takes from government agencies. Let's say the CBP, the $24.5 million order. There's also local police departments. And I bring that up because there are government websites that have a record of every order placed by the government, for government agencies, not local law enforcement, police departments. And we can use that government website to track that, hey, this $800,000 order came in Q2, and Virta says they had $1 million in orders come in, they call it bookings, in that same quarter. So by deductive reasoning, we can say there are $200,000 of non-government orders, meaning local law enforcement, or potentially, since I haven't been able to find anything IVIS related on any government website, I believe these are also going to be lumped in there. The IVIS program is classified in some sort, so it makes sense that they're not listed on the government website. So if, let's say, Virta takes $1 million in order in simulators and $500,000 in recoil kits, that's $1.5 million. If the government website says that they took $500,000 from government agencies, that leaves $1 million left for local law enforcement plus potentially IVIS. We're able to kind of triangulate what IVIS orders might look like, because there's a statement of objectives from the Army from 2018 that says, like, hey, for this test in February of 2021, we require 1,600 IVIS headsets. We required this many recoil kits, this many magazines. So we're able to kind of triangulate, hey, there's this $1 million in IVIS plus police departments, and we think IVIS was expected to do, let's say, $200,000 of that million. So we can say 800,000 belongs to the police department and 200,000 belongs to IVIS. So that's kind of the logic of what I did to get to this number. And then I have a chart to show if that makes sense for people ready to move on.
Yeah, no, let's, if you have a chart, yeah, visuals help.
Yeah. Wonderful. I imagine you can see my screen.
Yep.
Cool. So we'll start with this chart. Basically, we have revenue, we have bookings, which are, again, the orders taken in a given quarter. And like I said, there's two different ways to look at it. There's like government website and the non-government website. The government website here in this chart is red. It's called Gov Bookings. The blue line is non-government bookings. So that would be the police departments and potentially the IVIS program, like I said. You see that the red line is, I guess, taking a step back, Bob has always said that the revenues in the company are lumpy, but I don't think anyone has ever asked, or I haven't heard him say that bookings from a quarter to quarter are lumpy. You just kind of assume since revenue is, bookings probably are too, but I've kind of shown via this graph and the one to the right that that's not necessarily the case. Government bookings, they definitely look lumpy. You see a $5 million order here in Q3 2019. You see a quarter with zero, basically zero in 2018. The last two quarters, there's basically been $0 in bookings from government. But this blue line you see is relatively stable between $2 and $4 million historically. There's some ups and downs, but it's stable. Usually police departments order 1 or 2 simulators at a time. And there's so many sales staff to sell simulators. So it kind of makes sense to me that there's stability there. Whereas government, some agencies buy 20 simulators at a time or 11 driving simulators at a time, like the CBP did, or Department of State did in 2018 or 2019. So there's lumpiness in the red line, not so lumpy in the blue line. But here in the last 2 quarters and a little bit in Q4 2019, you see some pretty unexpected increases in these local police department plus IVIS, I call non-government bookings. Does do you follow, Ben? Does that make sense, folks?
Yeah, I think to clarify, when you say government versus non-government, I think you're talking about like federal government. So yeah, the non-government is like maybe local government, but when you say government, you mean federal, right?
Yeah, federal agencies like Department of State, CBP, right. Social Secret Service, things like that. Yeah, Foreign Naming Convention.
And that's a nice, that blue line is a nice, if that was a technical chart, you're like, this thing's breaking out. So what, again, just to clarify this the last 2 quarters, the 5.5 to 7.3, was there commentary in the last 2 calls? Do we have a good idea what caused that?
Yeah, so like I said, bookings tend to go kind of not talked about as much as revenue. We know revenue is lumpy. We know backlog continues to grow, but bookings tend to be, unless there's a large federal agency order, let's say like that 24 or the CBP announced an $800,000 order sometime in the last few months. Bob called that out on the conference call, and things like that occasionally get talked about. So we'll know that 800,000 probably belong in that 5.5 million quarter or number. But otherwise, these are all kind of unknown of what it includes.
So what's next after the 7.3? But why are you excited for this earnings call?
Yeah, so what I did was just plot these STP. STP stands for soldier touch points. It's these training events that the Army has planned and did, and it's essentially going back to that statement of objectives that I brought up earlier that said we require X amount of recoil kits, X amount of weapons, all this stuff, X amount of headsets. There are 4 of them. The second, third, and fourth of them required recoil kits. That first one, so the second STP was the first one that required recoil kits. That happened in Q4 2019. You notice the bookings also went up that quarter. And I think they required, I'll have to look. I think they required something like 57 total recoil kits, 27 M4 recoil kits, 12 M9, etc. So 57 recoil kits, it amounts to, from my estimation, about $700,000. And we saw this unexpected spike in this blue line, higher than pretty much any quarter, maybe even further back. It's the highest quarter we've ever seen of this I call non-gov or non-federal bookings. So kind of is a small hint, maybe a blip that if you were looking at it at the time, you weren't really sure what it was. But we call it out here. But there's this unexpected blip. And then again, in Q4 2020, there's this STP number 3, soldier touch point number 3, this test that required, again, going back to that statement of objectives, required roughly 200 recoil kits and accessories, and that amounts to roughly $2.5 million. Whether or not they use those original recoil kits from the previous STP or not, I'm not totally sure, but I'm assuming they did. So they purchased, let's say, 57 before, they need 200, so they only ordered 150 new ones. So I backed that out, so we're like $1.8 million in new orders. And we see again this huge spike in Q4 2020 that's brings it up to $5.5 million in non-gov bookings, which is kind of, again, a red flag or yellow flag of something's up, something's going on. And then again, you see Q1 2021 is even bigger than the last quarter. And what do you know, in Q2 2021 in April, so the following month after the end of the quarter, we need 540 recoil kits. We need roughly $7 million in recoil kit products. If you back out again the 2.5 million from before, it's 4 million in new recoil kit orders. 4 million in new recoil kits kind of fits pretty well in this. If you look at this chart to the right, if you back out that 4 million from the 7.3, you get 3.9 million. And so this is just the police department and commercial bookings. So it's essentially this blue line minus IBIS. And you look at it and it's pretty stable like you'd expect. So this is kind of my smoking gun of the financial statements that say, hey, something's going on. And it just so happens to align with IBIS and
Kevin, sorry. Where do you get this data from? The STP and this extrapolation you're making that these are for recoil kits. Where's that data coming from?
Yeah, so the Army released something called Statement of Objectives back in 2018 at the beginning of the IBIS program. It was available online. I don't know. It was posted by a handful of different publications, news sources, whatever. But essentially, if you scroll down, it says, here's this STP, and here's the requirements. The HUD is like the headset, the goggles that Microsoft is building. And further down, it says, there's a section for recoil kits. So STE squad training capabilities. STP2, which again is Q4 2019. It says, hey, for a squad, we need, there's recoil generating devices for M4. That means 9 of them per squad. And ancillary equipment required, which is like air compressors, things like that. And then it says we also need simulated magazines for these M4s. We need 7 simulated magazines, like I said, per M4. Same things for M9s, same things for M249s. And then further, each row is another STP. This is STP3. So it's essentially the same thing.
And how are you connecting the dots to that being Virta supplying these?
Yeah, so this goes back to my market research that I talked about. If there's only so many companies that build recoil kits, and Virta has patents on some of the differentiating technology that makes the recoil kits better than others. So I think I counted there's Virta has recoil kits, Inveris Training Solution has recoil kits, but again, they don't have that patent. Cubic is another competitor, and Laser Shot and TI Training. Those three all require laser attachments on top of their, or on the weapon. And the Army has called out specifically that they prefer not to have attachments on the weapon, and they want the weapon as streamlined as can be, so the training can be realistic. There's not going to be this giant box sitting on the barrel of your gun when you're going through training, and then won't be there during when you go to battle or you aren't in training anymore.
And I think you've probably triangulated that with other pieces of data from comments from management and things like that. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
So then what's your confidence level that, well, before I ask you the confidence level, where do you get the numbers? So you showed us qualitatively that they need those recoil kits, but the number you're putting in here to back out of the bookings, where are you getting that exact number from?
Yeah, so there's this USA spending website. You can search by the recipient. I have this link somewhere.
Man, you are prepared to answer all my questions, man.
I got it all. I've done a lot of work. But you can see over time, you can break it up by quarter, month. And if you download a CSV, you can get more details. But essentially Q4 2020, there was $3 million in federal bookings. Let me go back to the chart. Hopefully I did this right. Government bookings, I just imagine I did it right.
But that
Q4
number
2020.
on this website you're looking at now, does this number say this is just for the recoil kits?
No, this is for everything. So again, if you go back to Virta's financial statements, they're for everything. So they received, let's say, $10 million in orders. They never did that, but whatever. We say they took 3 million from this Gov spending website for federal orders.
Yeah, but how do you know that whole 3 million is going to Virta?
We filtered on who's the recipient here.
Oh, it says Virta.
For a given award, Virta. Yeah.
Whoa.
Sorry, I probably did it fast.
So this is a done deal in terms of knowing that those recoil kits are coming from Virta. I mean, that's.
So none of these orders are specifically to IVIS. These are other orders coming from the federal government, like that 11 driving simulators for Department of State was probably in here somewhere, or is in here somewhere. If we sort by end date, we can probably click through and find it. But essentially,
okay, so that's not only for recoil kits. It's for so, but the recoil kits are in here somewhere. You're saying?
In the USA spending, no. I think my hunch is that since the program is classified and no one can CEOs that are part of the program can't give details about it. Microsoft hasn't told even the federal government who's building components of the IVIS headset. And there's some meeting on August 15th, a report due on August 15th that documents a lot of this. But the federal government is starting to, if Microsoft or the Army doesn't start giving details about who their suppliers are, who their contractors are, they might withhold funding. But so like it's very clear that the details of who's supplying for IVIS is not public information. And even Bob himself, if you listen to the conference calls, he won't say IVIS, he won't say the Army, he says military.
So then I'm a little confused about something. Then that number, that 3.4 million, I think it was, that you're backing out. Why only 3.4 million? Like, couldn't there be an additional amount that's not reported because it's classified?
So I'll take a step back here just to clarify. We know that there are, let's say, 7.4 million in bookings in Q1. We know that the USA spending government website says there is only 0.1, so $100,000 in orders. So we know there's a 7.3 in unidentified orders taken that quarter. And then we can go back to that. We can triangulate by saying Well, the IVAS program required $3.5 million, and they would have placed an order in Q1 for that April test phase. So like, let's say somewhere between 1 and 3 months before the test. And so we're assuming there has to be some level of assumption here, but the stars kind of all align. So I don't think it's a wild assumption to make. Does that make sense?
7.3 in federal bookings, you're backing out the 3.4 that's reported. So the remainder would be
for local law enforcement and potentially IVAS.
And potentially IVAS. And that's captured in the chart on the right?
This is just the police department. This is police department plus IVAS.
Okay. Okay.
So again, this delta between 7.3 and 3.9 is what I think.
Okay, so it looks like you've demonstrated here with probably very high confidence that their bookings are increasing because of recoil kit, this recoil kit business, right?
Yeah.
With the military.
It's kind of triangulating what Bob has been talking about. The opportunity keeps getting larger, the timing of the IVAS program and testing, and it's public knowledge that the SCP-4 happened in April. So it's a bunch of triangulation, but
right.
I've done a lot of research and everything kind of aligns.
Great. You took me right where you wanted, April, right? So this is data ending March 31st. So what do you think's happened April, May, and June here that's going to be reported next week?
Yeah. So like I said, I'm estimating that there's this $3.5 million in I guess it was $4 million in orders, but if you assume some kind of discount, I'm guessing $3.5 million will be in the backlog from Q1. And my guess is since the SCP-4 happened in April in Q2, that it should hit revenue in the same quarter or in Q2. So my hunch is we'll see a pretty big order of 3 million plus
coming from the bookings,
revenue, coming from bookings or from backlog, from the backlog, because it goes from bookings last quarter to backlog. And into revenue in Q2.
Right, but so how do we know the magnitude and the sustainability of this? So we have 2 quarters of high bookings, right? But what's going to happen to that bookings number? Like, you have any insight into that? Yeah,
we do know. We do know there are some bookings. There are, if you Google like Virta and if you Google Virta in the news, you see, I think you saw. Maybe Anderson Cooper did a segment and a bunch of other local news websites report, hey, this local police department installed Virta and had their simulator delivered. And we kind of did some triangulation. There's a spreadsheet somewhere out there that we did some math and like, here's so like in March 21st, Odessa College had a simulator and there should be a news article for that one. Sioux City Police Department in May 11th, they bought a $100,000 V180 simulator and had it delivered. All these kind of things are kind of helping us triangulate this many bookings or this much additional revenues coming through.
That is some crazy research.
A lot of time, like I said. But
that's what I used to do. That's what I used to do when I didn't diversify and I had like 80% of my money in one stock. I used to do the same thing. But you're better at it than me, though.
It works. I mean, it's time, but it works and it helps us triangulate and get better information.
I think you mentioned SCP in April as well, so it's not just what you can Google in terms of the non-federal. Didn't you say there's something in April with an SCP?
Yeah, so the SCP-4 happened in April, so we expect that revenue to hit, that 3.5 million roughly revenue to hit in Q2. What else was there? There was also this FLETC order that, again, on Facebook, public information, they say we recently demonstrated to some high-ranking officials of these recently refreshed virtual firearm ranges. There's the government USA spending website again. We have the contract for, let's see, somewhere around here. Yeah, I don't know, whatever. There we go. This contract is for FLETC, $1.5 million. We know it was delivered in June. So to go along with that $3.5 roughly million, we have this $1.5 million also being delivered. So that right there is $5 million in what I expect to be revenue hitting in Q2. You compare that to historical revenues, and we already are at a pretty great quarter.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask you. I know you're very bullish on earnings next week. So you're saying you're expecting over 5 million in revenue in Q2?
That's my hunch. Yeah, I think historically those are only 2 orders, right? IVIS is usually not talked about by Bob, and it wasn't historically available, or it wasn't historically included in revenue, and they typically sat at, let's say, 3 million plus, or sometimes up to 5 or 6 million. So if you take those 2 very simple orders to go along with all the other orders that are probably going to flow through as well, you're looking at a pretty great quarter in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think the top of that range might be? Is that like 5 million, like the bottom? Could we possibly get an upside surprise? I would love to. It looks like you're pointing out some quarters here that 6.7. I see an 8.7. At what point are we going to get a record revenue quarter?
Yeah, I can't speak to total. I can't speak to what I really expect, because it's all just a guess. Like I said, all these 3.5, 4, and 3.9 bookings last few quarters, we don't know when they're going to hit. The company doesn't release a PR for everything, but we know on top of that $8 million in revenue that we just talked about, on top of the 5 million in revenue we just talked about, we know they recognize warranty every quarter. Somewhere in their 10Qs, they say extended warranties quarter over quarter, it's something like $700,000. It's been consistent, so we kind of can confidently add something like that, 700,000 on top of that 5 mil. We have customized software that I don't know how stable this is, but historically it's been pretty stable. So you can maybe throw in some amount of revenue there. Installations, they get paid for installing and training. We know training has been picking up, or will pick up in the future. So maybe you can assume this is going to grow or stay relatively stable for another $200,000. All these little things add up, and that's $6-7 million right there. And then what's left is police departments. You have the STEP revenue, which Bob hasn't publicly stated how much revenue they're bringing in per quarter of STEP revenue. So right there, we've put together $7 or $8 million, and there's still more to add in.
Okay, great. So financially, you're expecting a great quarter. You told me you're also expecting some sort of announcement, maybe related to the recoil kits, or so what's that about? Because on the one hand, you're telling me this stuff is all confidential, government can't say anything about it. So what kind of announcement do you think that they're going to be making?
Yeah, so historically, Virta has been pretty quiet about this opportunity on conference calls. I don't know exactly what they'll say on this one when they have potentially record revenue. In theory, or the IVIS program hasn't officially been productionalized. They still have that one user testing in August, September. But they've been talking about for the last year or so that they're going to productionalize the first production units of IVIS, and assuming all the components of that, recoil kits, etc., should come in and should start being produced in Q4. So whether it comes on this conference call or an announcement between conference call or between earnings calls, or during the next conference call, I'm not totally sure. But if Virta is actually going to win something, there should be an announcement prior to end of year or soon thereafter, saying, hey, we are providing recoil kits to the Army and as part of the IVIS program.
Okay. But why do you think that they're going to say that? Like, there's no confidentiality thing that they're not allowed to say it? You think they're allowed to reveal that?
I imagine at some point they have to come out and say we're doing it, but I don't know. I don't know when it'll be said, or if it'll be said. But at some point, if it comes through, we're going to be looking at tens of $millions of revenue per year. And it'd be pretty weird if Virta is this company that says we can't tell you where it's coming from or who's it's coming from, but here it is. So I don't know. I assume it has to be, but if someone wants to step in and say I've had experience in these type of things, please chime in. I'd love to hear it.
Okay, so you gave me a good background on what's going on. Does this connect to that $18 million raise they did?
Yeah. So in the conference, the Q1 conference, or in one of the conference calls, and I think there's a press release, they've said this $18 million raise was for ramping up production, among other things. So again, they only do two things, and they only build a few things in-house production, and that's recoil kits and threat fire devices. So
Yeah, I remember from the conversations I had with investor relations right after the 18 million raise, and then also on the YouTube interview, the VIP that became YouTube with Bob about a month later. I don't really remember them saying, and I probably, if you're saying it, I'm sure it happened, but I also remember them saying that this was not money they really needed. It was money that was, somewhat opportunistic for the price, but it was also for some sort of, there seemed to be hinting at some sort of big opportunity that it would help them, win. That's what to me, it sounded like they needed this money to, I don't know, like just speculating that they needed to have a strong balance sheet or something like that in order to get a huge win. That's not how you interpreted it?
yeah, so I think this very well could be the reason for it. If you're, like I said, over in this STP thing there, they have to do 540 recoil kits for only 1,600 headsets for SCP-4. And the Army is looking to produce from their budget doc, they were looking to do almost 30,000 units. So that's roughly 20 times or 15 times what they did in STP-4. So Virta is likely going to have to grow their recoil kit business somewhere around that 20x to kind of match the IVIS production growth. So it could very well be that it's a capital intensive process to build all these things, build all that hardware in-house, which they do. So it's very well that that $18 million could be used for hiring and then inventory, all that sort of things.
So, okay, let me show the screen share for a second. I'm sure there's more you want to say, but I just want to pause here to look at the chart again, right? Because you've demonstrated that they're going to have a good financial quarter. You've shown us that you think they're going to have some sort of announcement, maybe as early as next week, but sometime in the next quarter or two, because they're going to be doing tens of millions of annual revenue. What's that all mean for the price of the stock to you? What's the upside opportunity, particularly with what I want to just be a skeptic here is, again, assuming that the move from the mid fives to now consolidating here in the low sevens is from investors who are kind of anticipating this. What kind of room is left to the upside if the scenario you just talked about came true? What's this company's worth? What's the company's worth, and what's the stock worth?
Yeah, I won't speak to what will happen to the price, obviously, and I'm working with someone tomorrow to kind of button up the DCF to say, hey, if they do $20 million in additional revenue, what's that going to be worth? So I don't have a good number here. I don't know if it's going to go to 10 or 15 or whatever, but a company doing roughly 20 million in steady, predictable earnings, or 20 million in predictable revenue, tailwinds of federal mandated training, which Virta is the industry leader for, on top of being the one of the core suppliers for federal agencies. It seems like a lot of tailwinds all kind of adding up.
You mentioned the predictable. So how long, how do we know, just to help us understand one time versus recurring? Why would this recoil business, like how far in the future would this business recur with the military?
Yeah, so the Microsoft contract for IVIS is a 5-year contract with an option. It's either 5 one-year options or an additional 5-year option on top of it. So it's at least a 5-year opportunity, potentially 10-year opportunity. Cool. If everything works out.
Very nice. I like that.
And then I'll throw in, because I think it's super important, that the Marines have talked about building on top of whatever the Army is doing. So there's always that chance that in 2023, 2024, when the Marines pick up and IVIS in the Army is up and running, that the Marines come and do the exact same thing. I don't know the likelihood, it's obviously a couple years down the line, but there's that opportunity.
Cool. I like that. That's the story.
Yeah.
That's what I like. All right. It took us a little time to get to the exciting part, but all right. Anything else? I know that you have a lot of stuff, but we're already 9:57. So anything you really important that you want to get to in terms of the story, and basically why now? Well, why are we presenting to the story trading VIP community now? What is it that maybe you didn't mention that you want to mention?
Yeah, I think the one thing I skipped over that I think is super important is on the most recent conference call, the CEO said that there is material military orders in the backlog. He never gave a number. He just said it's confidential. I can't say much, but I
Cool.
can say it's material, which is super exciting.
All right, very good. We have a few questions. I'm going to pause the recording here to do the question part because we're already an hour in, and this way we can, people can ask their questions more freely. So so let me just go through a couple closing slides and we'll get to the questions. So okay, if you're a VIP member, you can collaborate further in the VTSI research group with Kevin and myself. Again, we have lots of events coming up. We got like 5 or 6 events in the next 2 weeks. So go to StoryTrading.com, click on VIP events to see what's coming. Follow us on YouTube and on Twitter. And with that, we're going to go to our question and answer session right now. Thanks. See you guys next time.